Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Jack Chuang, and welcome to another podcast related to psychology. And today's long form lecture is related to the chapter normally found in an Intro to Psych textbook or course that is called Lifespan Development. Now, I like the fact that this course, whether you're taking a lifespan course or reading this chapter, covering this chapter in your course, that I like the fact that this term lifespan is used because this is also representing the field of developmental psychology. And developmental psychology oftentimes gets misunderstood for being child psychology. Okay, so child psychology is very limited in terms of the age range of what the researchers are looking at. But lifespan, as you can see, covers the entire lifespan. And by the way, I'm recording today's episode from my mobile Psychology Concepts Explained studio, which is our Class B camper van, parked outside in the extended family's driveway. It's the only quiet place, solitary place where I can think and to do a lecture like this. And thanks to the small dog next door, you can tell that I'm not alone. Okay, all right, let's go and get started. So I'm going to cover some of the major concepts in a lifespan chapter. Now, of course, any of these lectures are not going to be comprehensive. Your course may focus on different subjects, so there may be some subjects I might neglect, but even for my own students, I'm not covering every single subject that you should be reading, but I'm covering some of the big ones, okay? And think about lifespan as how we change over time, okay? From conception, our genetics, all the way through death and our rituals regarding grieving. That's what lifespan is about, and every issue up until then. So it focuses on our biological changes as well as our mental or cognitive changes. When do we peak? When do we start to decline? What are some aspects about our cognition that changes over time, as well as our psychosocial development, right? So psychosocial has to do with our connections with others, right? In terms of how they affect our well-being. Yeah, I'm going to have to do something about that little dog. No, I'm not advocating violence, okay? But I might have to close a window here or there. It's already humid as it is. Okay, so what is lifespan development? And if you're listening to this on the audio only, I'm using the openstacks.org Psychology 2nd Edition PowerPoint slide to guide through this conversation. So I'll try to be as thorough as possible for you who are only listening. Well, as I mentioned just earlier, developmental psychologists typically, and you'll see this in a typical lifespan psychology textbook, and the ones that I use by Kathleen Berger also do this, is that our lifespan has 3 different domains or areas of focus. There's physical development, of course, that means changes in the body, the brain, our motor skills. And whenever you see the term motor skills, it refers to our physical movement, okay? And anything related to our health and wellness, like our weight, changes in the blood, our cholesterol level, obesity, that's all part of physical development. Cognitive development is another category where it focuses on how we make sense of the world, how do we solve problems, language development, okay, reasoning, creativity, how we learn. And then the third category is psychosocial development, and that has to do with our social relationships, our personality, how we express our emotions, okay? So it's a combination of the word psychology and our social connections. And the normative approach, and this has to be talked about in the field of psychology. I think a lot of people hear the word normal and they're wondering, well, does that mean there is such a thing as normal versus abnormal, like say behavior or development? Well, think of here normal as a statistical word, normative, right? So the normative approach has to do with data that's gathered with large numbers of children, okay, or people in general of any age group, where statistically, when do things happen? When are these developmental milestones? Okay, for example, just as an example, When does a baby start to crawl, walk, or start to speak in sentences? When they start puberty. Now, you know that's going to vary, right? But there tends to be an average range where the majority of infants or children start to develop these skills or behaviors at a certain time, right? And that's, so think of that as the word normative. So some people may develop early. You may know people in your family that have started to speak or very talkative at a very early age. Some waited till their second year before they started talking and started worrying their parents as to whether their child has a problem, right? And so that's what normal means, is that there's a range in which most people, whatever age group you're looking at, start to have or exhibit certain behaviors or signs of something, okay? Now, some of these changes are universal, like hitting puberty, right? Biological milestones. Now, universal means that it happens to all of us, but it doesn't happen to all of us at the same time. And they may vary across cultures, right? Okay. Now, our development can be seen as either, some things can be seen as continuous, right? For example, our height and weight is continuous. That is, there's a specific line. In other words, I cannot jump from being 5 feet tall to 5'8", right? There's a gradual growth there. Even if someone has a fast growth spurt over a summer, they're still going from 5 foot to 5 foot .001, 002. You know what I mean? So they're gaining weight, gaining height in that manner. That's called continuous. And a lot of these theories that we'll talk about, these so-called stage theories, are what we call discontinuous development, that there are things that occur in our lifetime that occur in unique stages. Now, whether that's at a specific age or a specific time for each of us, that would be considered discontinuous development, such as when we start walking, right? We go from crawling to walking, and that just sort of suddenly happens one day, in a sense, okay? And or the ability to speak certain words, right? That just sort of pops out and happens, and it may happen at different times for each of us, but that's what's an example of discontinuous development. All right, now when we talk about these theories, are they universal? Does it apply to every single person? Now, there's a lot of evidence that many of the things we'll talk about today do exhibit a single course of development, okay? One course development, meaning that everyone goes through a similar sequence. Sometimes, though, specific cultural differences in, say, upbringing, for example, or childcare practices may accelerate or inhibit some of those milestones. So those milestones will still be there, but sometimes they may be delayed or just depending on that particular culture, right? So most industrialized cultures, you can see very similar patterns, but then if you examine an isolated culture, perhaps with less technology, then perhaps their language development might be slightly different, right? Not good or bad, but it just may be slower, delayed compared to, say, an industrialized nation, where we hit the kids with a lot of books early on, for example, okay? But many of the things that we do in life are fairly consistent and universal. All right. Now, a constant theme or a major theme in developmental psychology or lifespan is the idea of nature versus nurture, right? And in a way, the versus, is kind of misleading. It makes it sound like it's either or, right? It's kind of like boxing, Ali versus Frazier. Oh man, I'm showing my age. Okay, I can use other examples. But nature refers to what we've inherited genetically, okay? Sometimes when it comes to athletes, men or women, professional or amateur, sometimes I notice that as observers of these professional sports, and you may hear this in people who are commentating on sports, is that when they see an athlete that's superior to others, sometimes they overemphasize their biology, right? That they're gifted. Have you ever heard that? They're a gifted athlete. Now, that is probably partially true, that you've seen many. I'm old enough now to see the sons of professional athletes that I admired now are in professional sports. And I'm thinking, wow, already their son is playing football or basketball. I used to watch their father play, right? And so it's easy to say, wow, that's just, of course, Barry Bonds is the son of Bobby Bonds. Of course, he would be a great athlete. He's probably been swinging a baseball bat, throwing a ball since they were an infant. Well, that's the interesting thing, right? I mean, of course, they inherit a certain set of genetics, but a lot of people inherit genetics where perhaps it gives them a certain height advantage or weight advantage, right? Or speed advantage, but not actually, I would say a small minority of them make it to a very elite level of sport. So why is that? Well, we cannot ignore nurture, right? That's the environment and the culture that someone is brought up in. So sometimes to me, depending on the subject, it's not very fruitful or useful to talk about nature versus nurture, but nature and nurture, right? We could compare to say which component was maybe more powerful than the other, but it's kind of hard to ignore. It's hard to say something was 100% nature. A lot of our diseases that we may have, that's why we fill out medical forms about our medical history, is that your physician wants to know, well, do you have any inherited risks? That's the nature component, right? Or did you inherit this gene? Last year I had some bad headaches. I went to see a neurologist, right? He said, oh, let's just run some blood tests. Well, what he did not tell me was that the blood test was going to be $500. Okay, that's another story. So I'm not going back to him. Should have told me in advance. I should have asked. That's my responsibility. I figured, well, I've met my insurance deductible, so I should be only paying 15% of whatever. But some of these tests were elective, so my insurance did not cover them, such as the Alzheimer's gene test. Don't you think a doctor should tell you that, before revealing the results, that you're going to be tested over this? It might be something you want to think about. My grandmother on my father's side passed away of Alzheimer's disease, right? My father is 81 and a half now. He's always worried about whether he's inherited that from his mother. And I have to worry about that, whether I'm inheriting it. And all of a sudden, bam, oh, you tested negative for the Alzheimer's gene, right? Which was good news, but is that a guarantee that I won't suffer from dementia 30 years from now? That's not a guarantee, right? It just means that you have a higher probability if you carry a certain gene. But oftentimes with our genes, we require an environmental trigger, right? And an experience, something that we're exposed to. Sometimes it's a trauma, right? That makes us more likely to become addicted, right? So we might inherit the gene that makes us more likely to be addicted to a certain chemical. But if we manage our stress levels and use proper coping mechanisms, that gene may not ever be activated, you see. So it's usually an interaction, okay, of them. But in order to understand this, researchers often use, and some universities are famous for this. I believe the University of Minnesota is famous for doing their twin studies, where they compare adults who were adopted as children or twins who were raised apart, right? And do a bunch of measurements and personality tests to see what kinds of things are they similar. If two people were raised in different environments and different socioeconomic statuses, one person, let's say one of the twins was adopted by a wealthy family, one was adopted by a relatively poor family with a different diet, how do they end up 40 years from that point, right? And so you can make a determination that, well, if they chose similar careers, if they had similar education, they're exactly the same height and weight, then you could say that, wow, their genetics, that there must be a really large genetic component to this. My coffee's cold now. All right, let's move on. Okay, so in this segment, we're going to talk about theories of development. And when you take a lifespan course, what's interesting about that is that from chapter 1 through chapter 25, or however many chapters you have in that book, you will cover a little bit of these theories along the way, because these theories oftentimes cover the entire lifespan. So we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud's very controversial psychosexual theory of development. We'll talk about Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory of development, which some might think of as an improvement over Freud, even though they're both psychoanalysts. Jean Piaget's cognitive theory of development, which is also one of the most famous in a lifespan course. So you can't go through a lifespan course or chapter without learning about Piaget. That's supposed to be an asterisk. Okay, so then we finish up with Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Now this is pretty interesting too. And try to apply these to yourself in a sense that, well, how do you see yourself? Can you relate your own life with regards to these particular theories? Now, let's start with Freud. And I could really spend 30 minutes on each of these, so I'm going to try to be relatively brief if possible. Now, one of the main takeaways of Sigmund Freud's theories, and remember he's an Austrian physician, psychiatrist, okay? And one of the most influential because a lot of his ideas still persist in our current culture. But the downside is, I'm giving you a nutshell explanation about Freud, is that a lot of his ideas, because of the concepts the way they are, they're very difficult to prove or to study scientifically. Okay, if you believe that our childhood experiences somehow have an influence on us as adults, they shape our personalities and behaviors, then you're kind of in line with Freud. And a lot of his ideas persist because they make common sense, right? Even though they're very difficult to, say, prove or disprove. Development is discontinuous, means that there's particular stages, right? And these stages, he calls them the psychosexual stages. And what that really means is that it doesn't really mean that a 2-year-old has sexual urges the same way an adult has, of course. But what you can think about is that ever since we were born, we have different, we're always trying to seek pleasure of some kind, okay? So I know it's difficult to sort of conceptualize because the title of his theory is psychosexual, but think of it as even children have a pleasure zone. They do something that makes them feel good to satisfy a certain urge, okay? And of course, after puberty, that urge becomes more of a sexual urge that we think of that adults have, okay? So I know you can be thrown off. It's easy to be thrown off of Freud's ideas when you think about that he's talking about sexuality, then he's talking about children. It's like, it makes you uncomfortable. But you don't have to conceptualize it that way. Just think of it as that each person at a given age has erogenous zones. Okay, and there are 5 of these stages. And these will sound familiar. And I encourage you to watch actually the old sitcom. What's the name of it? Dang it. It'll come to me. Let me think. What was that show? Man, it was right on the tip of my tongue. Okay, I'm going to have to come back to that. All right, so there are 5 stages here. And the first stage is the oral stage. And this is by age, okay? So during infancy, when we're born, and the erogenous zone, where we seek pleasure is our mouth, right? And think about it. Through Freud's observation, what do newborns do? They feed. That's pretty much what they do. I mean, yeah, they poop, okay, but the primary goal is to feed, right? So if they're not feeding, they're sucking on stuff, right? You give them a pacifier, they're crying, that kind of thing. And so it kind of makes sense that they're satisfying themselves orally. Now, one of the themes of this theory is like, well, how does this relate to us as adults? Is that even though you may not have a conscious memory of being a baby and being fed and all that, the idea is that, remember, Freud believes that we have an unconscious. So these early life experiences are buried in our unconscious level, right, that we don't have easy access to. And if we do not go through a certain stage with proper parenting and nurturing, then we could have a conflict that he calls a fixation. Okay? And a fixation is going to reveal itself once we're an adult, through certain problems. Let's say like alcoholism, right? If you think about it, that's an addiction, a hand-to-mouth addiction, right? Someone who's a compulsive eater, that's a hand-to-mouth addiction. They're medicated. Someone is medicating themselves through alcohol, through food, right? So if Freud would have observed this patient today, they would say that, wow, you have an oral fixation, right? So according to his theory, something must have happened to you early on where your oral urges were not satisfied. Maybe you were not given enough food at that age, enough nurturing at that age, okay? So you're craving this even as an adult at some unconscious level. And to soothe yourself, right, you use alcohol. To soothe that pain, you use food, right? So that would be considered an oral fixation. How do you get over this fixation? Well, you go through psychoanalysis, right? That's the famous Freud's form of therapy, where someone's lying on the couch trying to relax their mind, dig into their childhood experiences, right? Maybe not literally go to feeding, right? But it's try to undo some of the damages of the past, okay? Then if you think about it, a few years later, the anus, right? Now that's now this might sound strange. How is that possibly an erogenous zone, right? No, we're not talking about anal sex and, in that way. But we're talking about pooping, right? We're talking about, at that age, we're so focused on doing something correctly, and that is pooping appropriately, potty training, okay, potty training. And if you think about it in that respect, say, oh, that makes sense now. We're trying to control how we poop. And if we poop well, we get a lot of rewards from our parents, right? Because they're extremely happy that they don't have to wipe your butt anymore and change diapers, right? So that's a thrilling moment for parents to graduate a toddler from changing their diaper a few times a day to you saying, I have to go potty, and you go potty, right? And learn how to flush and eventually learn how to wipe properly, front to back, all that kind of stuff. and and there you go, okay? And so you can see how potty training can go wrong, right? So if potty training goes wrong, then someone can have an anal fixation. Now, in our American culture, sometimes people refer to people as anal, like that's part of their personality. Some people may say, I am so anal about this, about that. Now, you may be wondering, especially if English is your second language, or if you're new to American culture, why in the world are people using this word anal? That is pretty disgusting. I can understand oral fixation, but why are people saying they have an anal personality, right? What Freud is saying is that if somehow you do not go through this potty training stage in a balanced, healthy way, one of the bad results is that you may have what's called an anal retentive personality. Think about what retentive means, to hold in. It means your anus is tight, okay? It means you're like constipated. You're not pooping properly, right? And I'm sorry if you're eating breakfast or having a meal during this. I should have warned you, right? And if you think about what an anal person is, now some people confuse this or equate this with OCD-like behaviors, obsessive compulsive disorder. Like being anal means having to be very clean. Well, if you being organized, well, that kind of sort of is true, meaning that someone is very uptight about things, so they can't just have things laying around. They have to be organized and clean. But being uptight has another meaning. It means that they're not freely giving away their personality, right? They're only nice to people when they have to be, you see? They're holding that part in. So they're not pleasant people to be around, okay? So think about someone who's constipated for a week, right? They're not pleasant to be around. Okay? So that's called the uptight personality. They're anxious about things. My wife accuses me of being an anxious traveler. I worry about this. Did we lock that, right? And so maybe I have a somewhat anal personality, right? So the opposite of that, what's the opposite of constipation? That would be diarrhea. Sorry, again, if you're eating, right? So someone might have a diarrhea kind of personality where they're sort of all over the place, right? So you can be extremely uptight, or you can be extremely like sort of loose, meaning that you just let everything go. Yeah, you don't care about stuff. You just, your place is a mess, right? sort of figuratively like diarrhea, right? It's like a mess, right? Again, anal retentive means you're just very, very uptight, right? You're very cheap, okay? You're not going to give money away. You're not going to pay more than you have to. Someone who has a diarrhea personality, they're just going to be always in debt. They can't hold on to their money. They spend on everything, you see? So ideally, you want to have a balance so you don't end up with an anal fixation. All right, now as we go through our puberty years, we hit the phallic stage. And this is where the erogenous zone is no longer the mouth, no longer the anus, but is now our sexual organs, right? That kind of makes sense, right? If you think about, well, okay, that's what happens when we reach puberty and all that, right? And so when we reach this particular phase, one of the main themes is that we have a particular fixation called the Oedipus. Okay, fixation, right? And what the Oedipus fixation is that Freud believes that in a heterosexual sense, boys have an attraction to moms and girls. Well, let me rephrase that. The Oedipus complex. And girls suffer from the Electra complex. Means that Oedipus complex boys have an attraction to mom. Electra complex girls have an attraction to dad, right? And so let's think about that from the boys' point of view. What does this really mean? Is that if you think about how, while you may not literally feel like you have the hots for your mom, okay, you have a sexual attraction to your mom, right? That's socially unacceptable, right? Because that's incest, right? That's a very incestuous thing, right? But at a very younger age, okay, we're not talking about a 17-year-old, but maybe a 10-year-old, or even younger, you may see young children sort of play this out, that they desperately want mom's attention. And if mom is spending a lot of time with dad, then they're jealous of dad's attention to mom, right? And Freud even goes so far as to say that little boys have an unconscious desire to want to kill off their fathers so they can be with their mothers, right? And that is what this conflict is all about. Now, if someone goes through the stage in a healthy way, again, I'm focusing on the boys, then what's going to happen is that they will have a close relationship to mom. They'll be okay with their dads, and their future spouses or relationship partners will somehow resemble their moms, but they don't have an overwhelming desire to find a woman to be their mom, right? To replace their mom. But if you think about in everyday life, don't we often say, and I've heard people say that, that, well, I love my wife because she has a lot of qualities that my mom has, actually, right? And so if you think about it from another perspective, is that our guardians and our parents, they're our role models for what relationships should be like. Okay, now, of course, that could be good or bad, right? So if we witness a lot of abuse, sometimes we find ourselves in abusive relationships later on. And so this is sort of Freud's take on it, but just using, of course, a very extreme kind of metaphor to explain this. So a lot of unhealthy adult relationships, Freud may go back and say, well, you have this complex here. If you're a woman, you have an Electra complex. You're trying to find a daddy figure to replace your dad because you have an overwhelming attraction to your father growing up, right? And that's why you end up finding male partners that are not good for you, or have the same personality traits as your father if they're verbally abusive, right? So Freud would make that kind of connection, okay? All right, so I'm sure a lot of you adult men out there are thinking, looking at their wives going, do you resemble my mom in any way? Am I part of this Oedipus complex? All right, and so the next stage is the latency stage, and this is I think the early teen years again. And if you think about kids in primary school and early teens, the latency stage means that there's really no fixation going on here. There's no particular erogenous zone. It's kind of like, man, let's just take a break from all these hormones. And kids are focused on school. They're not really going out there, chasing boys, opposite sex relationships or adult style relationships. And then the genital stage, this is where we're a little bit older in terms of hitting puberty. So if I said the phallic stage is when we hit puberty, that was a mistake. Okay. So the puberty, this is where we think of as the adult stage, where our focus is on our physical genitals. And so obviously if we go through this stage in a very healthy way, then we'll end up with fairly healthy sex life and adult relationships. But if somehow we have a fixation at the genital stage, then perhaps someone may have some sort of sexual addiction and some sort of imbalance in some way. So really the key idea to take away from here, if you want to use this idea in your life in a useful way, is to think about balance, right? Whether we're parents raising young children or whether we're adults now reflecting on our lives, did we go through various stages in a balanced way? What kind of problems do I have now as an adult, right? That could be traced to these kinds of things. And again, this is more of a theoretical framework. It's not necessarily something we can prove that an alcoholic has an oral fixation, but this is the theoretical framework that Freud would use to analyze someone. Okay? All right, so let's move on. That's Freud. So hopefully that made sense. You got some keywords out of that in terms of fixation, the different stages, the Oedipal Electra complexes, right? The attraction to the opposite sex parent and desire to replace or get rid of the same sex parent, right? Pretty twisted stuff. But again, if you look at it, you have to look at it through different lenses in a different way that it can kind of make sense, right? Especially that anal personality, right? And the oral fixation, I think a lot of that people can relate to. All right. Now, Erik Erikson is also a psychoanalyst because he believes in the ego and the unconscious, right? But he emphasizes that throughout our lifetime, we're trying to meet certain challenges. Okay? We have certain goals we want to meet. And depending on our social environment and our relationships, that could affect each of these stages. Okay? And so let's move on and talk about what these 8 stages are. Now, I'm not going to go through this in great detail. This I think you can study on your own. But if you look up Erik Erikson's Psychosocial Stages of Development, I always thought his name was kind of interesting, that he would be named Erik Erikson. It's like someone being named Jack Jackson. Anyways, that's just something I've always thought was kind of interesting. Or weird, okay. All right, so trust versus mistrust. So if you look at the chart here, and if you don't have access to one, that's fine. But these 8 stages range from the first year of life. The second stage is 1 to 3, then 3 to 6, 7 to 11 years of age, and then the teenage years, adolescent years, 12 to 18. Then you have the early adult years, 19 to 29 years old. Then the adult years, 30 to 64, and then 65 plus, right? So it's split up into 8 age groups. And let me just focus on a couple of these, just as an example, okay? Well, each of these stages of life, we have a challenge that we must overcome, right? So we're trying to, the key phrase here, resolve conflicts. Kind of like video games, right? You have to meet certain challenges before you go to the next level. I'm speaking out of turn because I'm not really a gamer ever since. I just never got into it. I don't know why. Maybe you all can introduce me to some games to ease this middle-aged guy into and hopefully not get addicted to it, but just use it as a diversion. At least maybe it'll improve my mental skills so I can remember people I'm trying to remember or TV shows I'm trying to remember offhand. It's really something that I used to do really well, and then all of a sudden it's like, Frasier, there you go. The TV show Frasier. See, my Google search was a little delayed. So that's the show where he and his brother Miles, I think it was Miles, they play brothers, okay, where it's kind of an interesting dynamic, right? They're sort of uppity and they play psychoanalysts, so oftentimes you'll hear them throw around many Freudian concepts in their show. So I highly recommend it. It's a clean family show. It's a comedy. But you'll see a lot of hidden and not so hidden references to Freud, obviously, because that's the whole point of the show. Okay, man, got that out of the way. Feel better now. Okay, so trust versus mistrust. This happens during infancy, right? So if you think about it, this is the major conflict, right? So as a parent raising a baby, you want to develop that trust, okay? So that means that when they're crying, you soothe them. When they're hungry, you feed them. So now they may not be able to think in a complicated way, but they know that, oh, there's someone there I can rely on. Okay, someone always responds to me when I'm in need. Okay, giving me nourishment or affection. So then develop a sense of trust. Now, the whole idea here is that if we go through the stage in a very healthy way, then as an adult, in our own relationships with friends and close relationships, romantic relationships, we will have a healthy sense of trust of others, right? Now, if you went through that stage, even though you will claim you have no conscious memory of being a baby, but if you had neglect of some kind, then it's possible, according to Erikson, that as an adult you'll have trouble trusting people. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the teenage years, just to skip ahead. This is stage 5, identity versus confusion. That kind of self-explanatory, isn't it? And if you think about what adolescents have to go through in their teen years, right? In those middle school, high school years, and going to the next stage of college or going to the workforce and being independent, they're really trying to identify who they are. And that is why you see a lot of experimentation, uh, belonging to certain social groups, changing the way they dress. Like my daughter, a huge part of her current identity at 17 is that she is a BTS Army, right? I don't have to explain what that is. I think if you don't know, Google that, okay? Or DuckDuckGo it. I don't use Google much anymore. And search for that. And this is basically a fandom, right, of a Korean K-pop band, the most popular band in the world, sort of like the Beatles of the 1960s. That's how popular they are in terms of their music and their fan following, right? But the Beatles did it without social media, so now we have social media. And so this sort of came on suddenly, right? So those who have teenagers in the house, you can see these shifts happen. Huge personality shifts, change in appearance and so forth, right? So it's something to watch out for. But this is their attempt to push some boundaries, to seek out their identity and what their roles are in life. And so they may sway back and forth with having a certain identity, like, yeah, this is who I am this, I am that, versus a state of confusion, right? And they may rock back and forth or have a sort of a balance of the two, I guess. And then let's talk about older life. Well, during our main adult life, right, what do you think about we do most of the time? What's motivating us? Well, we want to be productive, we want to support our family, and that is called generativity, right? Having some sense of purpose in addition to being a provider, for example, whether you're a man or a woman, right? So how do you contribute to society? Are you participating, a productive part of your family? And then the opposite of that is stagnation, right? Are you feeling stuck, feeling like your life is going nowhere? You're in a dead-end job. You're not really making the amount of money. You feel financially stuck, right? So this 34-year span of being an adult in your 30s all the way through your early 60s pre-retirement age, this is the main conflict. And I think a lot of us can relate to this, right? It makes a lot of common sense that at this stage in our lives, this is what we're doing. So at 53, at the time of this recording, yeah, I've gone through a lot of this. I've thought about, well, do I need to switch careers? I want to maybe spend less time in front of a computer because I teach online and I'm in front of a screen all the time. Maybe I can go work at a national park and be outdoors, right? And have a chance to travel a bit, right? And so, do I want to do that? Okay. And right now we sort of have a balance of that. We slow travel the world, try to be as economical as possible. I teach online, so it gives us some flexibility. And at the time of this recording, we're still during in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're really kind of trapped within the United States, right? That's how we feel. I think for most people, they feel like they're trapped inside their home. We feel like we're trapped in the U.S. So while we still have our camper van and we can drive around and go to different places, even out of state, but our true desire is to be overseas at least half of the year, and we can't do that. And because there's mass unemployment around the world because of the pandemic, suddenly I see my job as being very valuable, and And that's why I'm making more podcasts, because I'm trying to improve myself and make my classes even better. So now I've sudden more motivation and more interest in my courses. So that's my personal example of generativity during this stage. Now the 65 plus stage, again in Erikson's theory here, that's where we are. Stage 8, this is integrity versus despair. I know it sounds kind of sad, but this is where a person is having more reflection, trying to assess their life, make sense of their life. Maybe they're retired and not working full time, so they have a little bit more time to think about it. And they're reaching a certain stage where, some of your peers are passing away of illnesses, and you can definitely see that you don't have many years left. Okay. And I see my father going through this because he's 81 and a half and almost 82. He is 82 in Asian years. Okay. That's another story. And he's extremely healthy, right? I mean, he does Tai Chi, he teaches it to his friends, he can do certain flexible stretches that I can't do, so he's really sharp, okay? Other than a vision problem and had eye surgery, right? He's physically perfect, okay? No real problems. And he's a retired physicist, right? So anytime he does have a physical ailment, he's online, searching, reading, watching YouTube, and he can tell you the benefits of certain vitamin or certain procedure, and he's like suddenly a medical expert, right? And I'm sure that a lot of times listening to he and his friends talk, they talk about this sense of meaningfulness in life, right? And during the COVID pandemic, suddenly the lack of social connection, that's something they look forward to. They look forward to traveling the world as a group of retired friends. That's been shut down. And so what do? So you see a lot more despair amongst this group. So even though they're economically, financially very well off, they've done very well in their lives, they wanted to work very hard, and then at this time enjoy their lives, right? While they still can, while they're still ambulatory and healthy, but they're facing a lot of despair because of the pandemic. Okay, so that's Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. All right, let's move on to shift gears a little bit and talk about cognitive aspect. In this, we're going to talk about the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Okay. Cold coffee, nice. All right, it's a little too humid here. I wish I could turn on the AC, but it's going to be loud. All right, so let's keep going. This is my sweaty podcast. Okay. So Piaget had a very positive view. I love his view of children and how they're developing. But his main idea that I think is important to understand is that oftentimes, we as lay people look at children that we assume that at any age they should be conceptually being able to learn certain things. It's like, why is my child not able to figure this out? Why is it at 10 years old I still have to explain this to them? Oh, they're 12 now. Why can't they still? Okay. So Piaget, through his work, discovered that there are just certain things mentally that a child cannot wrap their heads around until they mature into it, until they physically grow into it. Okay? So it doesn't mean, it's not a neuron count or any kind of thing like that. It's not something you do with a blood test. And then it's a stage theory, but it varies amongst us as individuals. That suddenly we wake up one day and it's like, oh, I can solve this sort of puzzle that I couldn't do yesterday, right? And so he thinks of children as they develop in their activities that they're little scientists, right? I think that's a really interesting and positive view of kids, so that when there's a toddler in the house throwing spaghetti and you're just trying to scrape it off the ceiling, right? That instead of thinking, I have an evil child, that's what Freud would think, by the way. This kid who's fixated and who's the child of Satan, okay, who has animal instincts, gone wrong. Think about it more positively, like Piaget. And Piaget thinks of children as scientists. The child just wanted to know how far can spaghetti fly and how much a ceiling can absorb spaghetti, right? It's an experiment, right? They're developing their mind. So anytime your child is destroying their house, in the old days, I use the example of putting toast into a VCR. That's how old my podcasts were, believe it or not. But now I guess you have to use new examples. Let's say like sticking a banana into a USB port, whatever, okay? Oh, if you were Freud, you would think that was kind of sexual, but I didn't really mean it that way. Okay, so let's move on. So Piaget believes that a child develops schemata. That's a plural for schemes. Okay, and they're basically categories. So okay, this is a dog. That is a cat. Okay, this is an adult. Okay, and to help them understand the world, right? But you notice that with children and language, sometimes they miscategorize things. That's because they're still developing these schemata. And so what happens with these schemata over time is that they go through a couple processes, and sometimes students get these two confused. One's called assimilation, and one's called accommodation. You know, I think psychology is full of terminologies that rhyme and sound too much alike, and yet they mean the opposite sometimes. And I think if I were to rewrite psychology, I would just use terms that sometimes start with letter A, and then the opposite one would start with letter Z. Okay? You know, even apples and oranges is better than apples and snapples. You know, I mean, you know, you don't use terms that sound almost exactly like. So what is assimilation? Well, this is where a new piece of information, they're learning something new by relating it to something they already know. Okay, so let's say you're taking sociology. Oh yeah, sociology kind of makes sense because I'm comparing it to psychology. So that's in a form of assimilation of the concepts of sociology, right? Now, accommodation is where you have a new experience and it changes your existing schemata. So maybe you learned about industrial organizational psychology, right? And you didn't hear about this before, and you realize that, oh, you know, my job in my human resources department, HR, they have a bunch of psychologists working there. I had no idea. That's called accommodation. Your concept of psychology, your schemata of psychologists and what they do, their careers, suddenly has altered, right? You have to reshape that, and that's called accommodation. Okay, so again, you have to use some memory mnemonics to kind of make sense of assimilation or accommodation. Oh, is that a cool breeze? I need to open the window. Oh, my mother-in-law's outside. Okay, I can't open the window. All right, never mind. All right, so that's assimilation and accommodation. Now, this is what Piaget is most well known for. His stages of cognitive development. All right, and again, this is by age. Now, if you're older than 12, then you're in the last stage, okay, called formal operational. Newborns to 2-year-olds are in this stage called sensory motor stage. Now, if you were to take lifespan class, there are many more sub-stages within sensory motors, but we're in Intro to Psych right now at this level. So let me try to just make sense of each of these stages for you. So the sensory motor stage, think about what this word is made of. Sensor, okay, or senses, and motor. So sensory, this is our senses, what we feel and touch and see and hear. And then motor is our movement, right? So if you think about what babies do to try to make sense of the world, aren't they just touching everything, right? Putting everything in their mouth, tasting everything, right? And throwing things around. This is sensory motor, right? And this is their understanding of the world. They're trying to learn of the world this way. That's why we have all these very, stimulating things to hang over a crib that turn in circles, that make sounds, right? And you notice that infants and toddlers, they never get tired of a sound, no matter how annoying it is to adults, right? It seems to be a correlation that the greater annoyance to an adult is something they want to hear repeatedly, right? Like the sound of those little hammers that make the squeaking sound, squeak, 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 right? You know, it just doesn't matter. So, so I remember going through this stage with our daughter, and for her, that, not me, okay, and going through the toy section and trying to think of what toys to pick up, and she really liked this little lawnmower kind of toy that has that bubble with the balls in it that pops the moment you push it, right? So it's pop, 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 pop. And my wife and I looked at each other and thought, no, okay, not that one, okay, unless we're at a park or somewhere outdoors. Yes, you can use that. You can develop your brain using that, but outside. All right. So that is the sensory motor stage. Now, one example of the sensory motor stage that occurs is object permanence. Right. This is something that kicks in maybe 9 months of age, and some researchers say even earlier, but the average is about 9. A newer researcher claimed as early as 3 months, okay? So object permanence, and this is something we all as adults take for granted, is that we understand mentally that something still exists even though it becomes out of sight, right? So if we're driving down the road and you know there's a car behind you, then they change lanes to pass you, but you don't see them in your mirror. They did not just disappear into thin air, right? The car is still there, right? A person walks out of the room, you know that they're in the other room. They didn't just disappear. But think about why peekaboo is so exciting for infants and little toddlers in a stroller, right? Where you hide your face behind your hands and then they suddenly squeal when they're all happy when they see you. That's because you are literally disappearing and reappearing. So yes, they're freaking out, okay? It's like, why did dad just disappear? And all of a sudden he reappears out of nowhere. And we observe that as giggles and laughter, like they're amused, but you're probably traumatizing them. Okay, that part I'm kidding. Okay, they're probably just enjoying the stimulation of it. And that's why you can test them, right? You can have them play with the ball, roll the ball under a couch, and see if they're actually looking for it or trying to reach for it. Your dog might be, but your infant or early toddler may not be. They may just think, oh, well, I'll play with something else. The ball literally doesn't exist. Okay, so object permanence is something that kicks in, again, biologically, naturally. It's a mental skill that just kicks in. Okay, all right, now stranger anxiety is another example, okay, of, and this is kind of a good thing. I remember that when our daughter was a baby and pre-walking stage, so it was within this age range, we would have these large family gatherings and everybody wants to hold Emma, right? So we're passing her around and you can kind of see her whenever she's being passed to someone unfamiliar. She kind of gives us a glance like, is this person on the approved list of hugging, right? Or if we encounter a stranger and we're pushing on a stroller, we're having a talk with them, you can see her head tilting back and forth, looking at the stranger, looking at us, looking at the stranger, looking at us, right? And then, if we give sort of this approval, like it's okay, then she kind of calms down, right? So that stranger anxiety is part of the sensory motor stage. All right, let's move into ages 2 through 6. This is the pre-operational stage, right? Think of the word operational as logical, right? So pre-operational stage means they're pre-logical. It means that within that age range, because of a child's brain development, they still cannot figure some things out, okay? They are developing symbolic thinking using words, right? They're developing language, right? They understand that certain images relate to real things, okay? They see a picture of a dog. They know that's not the dog. They know it's a picture of a dog, okay? But they still lack some logical reasoning skills, okay? So they're able to extend and pretend play, right? A lot of kids like to do that, okay? But because of egocentrism, right, meaning that the world revolves around them, they see the world from only their point of view. I'm sure there's some adults who are still stuck in this stage, but for a 2 to 6-year-old, that's called egocentric thinking, right? It means that they have a hard time thinking from another person's point of view, okay? And in cognitive psychology, that's called theory of mind, right? Being able to understand that someone else has their own experience and you can empathize with that person. Okay. All right, so that's the pre-operational stage, still limited in their thinking. From 7 to 11, suddenly they're in the concrete operational stage, okay? What that means is that they're able to do certain things mathematically, right? So they're mentally able to solve certain types of problems they weren't able to do before, not because of access to a math book or having a math tutor, but because of just their brain developing into that phase. And they're able to understand the principle of conservation. And I wonder if in the book this graphic is a typo. They wrote in conversation. I think they meant conservation, right? So what is that? Conservation is just this idea in physics that you take an object and no matter how much you change the shape, that object, that mass or volume is still the same. So for example, if I were to pour a cup of coffee from this mug of mine and poured it into a tall, skinny glass, I know that the same amount of liquid is in that glass, even though it just looks different. That's called the principle of conservation, right? And so from 7 to 11, they suddenly get it. And there's a very famous test, and there are a series of these tests you can do with children. I did this with my daughter early on. Back then, we didn't have cell phones and cell phone videos, so it's on tape somewhere. It was really cute. And unfortunately, when I did this the first time, the results came out as I expected. But then when I started taping, Emma would start to sort of rehearse her answer. So it sounded like I'm teaching her what to say instead of being spontaneous. Anyway, so if you have let's say a 5, 6, 7-year-old, right? So right on that borderline age, give them this test. Take 2 cups of different shapes. Pour water or milk or whatever into one of those cups, okay? And you can show them that, let's start over. Have 2 cups that are the same, rather, okay? Pour the same amount in each cup and have them look at the cups and say, okay, these 2 cups, they have the same amount of water. And little kids take those things seriously, right? They're like, yeah, they'll examine it for a while. Like, yeah, I think they're the same. And then you take a 3rd cup that's of different shape, right? Whether it's tall and skinny, low and pudgy. No, okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not fat shaming. This is just the shape of a glass. You pour it into that glass, and then now you take that other glass, that original one, the second one, and this new one, and you put them side by side and say, okay, now I poured this water from here to there. Now let's look at these 2 glasses of water. Are they the same or are they a different amount of water, right? Now you cannot lead them. Just make the question as basic as possible, and they will start to study this, right? If they're in the pre-operational stage, they still don't mentally understand the principle of conservation. What do you think they're going to do? They'll pick the water level that's the higher one and say that that cup has more water. Now, as a parent or as an older sibling or whatever, don't just assume that, oh my gosh, my little cousin's stupid, No, don't ever think that. What it is that that's their level of development, right? Now, if you do the same test with a kid who now has the understanding of conservation, again, not through teaching, but just through mental growth, they will look at you and go, you're kidding me, right? You're really asking me that whether these 2 glasses of water have the same amount of water. And they'll storm out thinking, what do you think, I'm stupid, right? So they go from not getting it to getting it, and you may not know what day that's going to be, right? But then once they get it, it's just sort of a no-brainer, right? And the reason that they can get it is that they have a skill, and it's not listed in this chart, called reversibility, right? So in the pre-operational stage, that child has irreversibility, meaning that they have a hard time mentally rewinding a series of events. So it's almost like they forgot that the water in this second cup came from that water in the first cup. They can only notice what's in the second cup, okay? Whereas the concrete operational child, they know that, well, if you poured water from that cup, it's the same water that exists in the second cup, so it's the same amount. And that's the kind of tone they'll use, okay? So that's called reversibility. Now, also centration is at play, right? Centration. It's based on the word center. This belongs over here in the pre-operational stage. So irreversibility, ability, and centration, okay? They belong in the pre-operational. Centration means that when they solve problems, kids of that age only look at really one aspect of it at a time. They have a hard time juggling different contexts, okay? So they look at just the height of that. And you can do this same test with some clay, right? Moldable clay like Play-Doh. My wife slipped one day many years ago and called it Clay-Doh. I thought it was very cute. We still make fun of her to this day. Okay, so you take some Play-Doh and you mold it, 2 balls in a certain size, and then okay, don't go Freud here, okay? So you have 2 of these clay balls, right? And you show them to a child and say, okay, they're the same size? Say, yes, they're the same size. Okay. Then you take one of them and you literally, in front of them, there's no trick, you pound the heck out of this one to make it like a pancake. And then you say, okay, compared to this ball of Play-Doh and this pancake of Play-Doh, which one has more Play-Doh? And the pre-operational child will look at that pancake because it takes up more space on the table and say, "That, hey, there's more Play-Doh here. That was magical," right? And so again, that's due to the factors we just talked about. So that's also a test of the principle of conservation, right? So whether it comes to doing mathematical equations or solving these sort of simple tests that we think of, and that's why, younger children have tough time with money, with coins, right? So again, in America, we have a dime, that's 10 cents, and a nickel is 5 cents, but the nickel is physically bigger than the dime, right? So you ask a younger child who's maybe 5 years old, which one of these is more money? The dime or the nickel? And they will say the nickel because it's bigger. And that makes you wonder why they made the nickel so big, right? Okay, so now we move from to the adolescent years, and now we're in the formal operational stage. That means that not only can we think logically and figure out certain types of problems, but now we have the addition of abstract reasoning and moral reasoning, more complicated moral reasoning. So an example of abstract versus concrete, right? So one thing you can ask someone who's maybe 10 years old that you think is in the concrete operational stage is to ask them to define what love is. And they may use very concrete examples like love is holding hands, right? Love is kissing, okay? Love is hugging. And then you ask a teenager what love is, and they'll go into this big, deep philosophical, oh, it's when our souls are connecting, and we just see eye to eye on things, and they complete my sentences and all that kind of crap, right? And so that is an example of abstract thinking, okay? And that is something we do as adults, okay? So we no longer have to think in this very visual, concrete way. So there you go. Those are the 4 stages of cognitive development. We start off by just touching and throwing things around, tasting things. That's the sensory motor stage, right? We develop object permanence, luckily. Things still exist even though we don't see them. Then we're in this pre-operational stage. So we develop language, we're able to do certain things, but we still can't solve certain logical problems just because our brain hasn't matured enough yet. We suffer from irreversibility. It's like our rewind button is broken on a video player. We can't play things back. We suffer from centration. Now, these are not disorders, okay? It's just a normal state of mind at that stage. But we're developing language pretty good, a lot of words. And then we ease into concrete operational. We wake up one day and we understand that we pour water into different containers and it's the same amount. It's amazing, okay? But we're still limited because we still see love as holding hands. And then we graduate into the formal operational stage where suddenly we're philosophers, okay? And can think in abstract ways. All right, now another theory of development is Kohlberg's theory of moral development. This is from Lawrence Kohlberg, right? And you can see this really in our children and as adults in terms of how someone gives reasons and motivations for why they make certain choices in terms of good or bad. So let's look at these 3 levels. The first level is called pre-conventional morality, right? So this is the sense of, well, I'm only going to do certain things because I'm avoiding direct punishment, okay? So think about seatbelt laws when you're driving a car, right? Some people put them on because they think it's going to keep them safe. Some people put them on because they just want to obey the law. Or not be shunned by people in the car. It's like people are going to yell at you, right? So you want to be part of the group. And then there's a very simplest level that I don't want to get a ticket. That is the only reason. If they're driving on a country road and they don't know cops are around, this is the kind of person who does not wear a seatbelt. They don't see so it's really driven by self-interests, okay? I'm only going by the rules because I'm trying to avoid punishment. Okay, I don't want to get caught. It's the only reason I'm not shoplifting today is because there's a camera in the shop. If that camera was not there, I would be taking this Twinkie home with me in my pocket. Okay? Now, level 2 is conventional morality. Conventional morality means that my behavior is driven by social approval. Okay? So I'm going to obey authority, and I'm going to conform because that's the law. That's the law. And that's pretty much simply it. Okay, I'm not going to steal because it's against the law. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Okay, so if we go into the post-conventional morality stage, right? So now it's a little bit more philosophical, right? So is it the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do? Not just legally, but at a different sort of moral, ethical level. So this is where we're driven by a sense of ethics and internal moral principles. Okay. For example, cheating on exams, right, is really not that hard, I should tell you honestly, to cheat on online tests. Now, there's smart cheaters and not so smart cheaters, right? But in the end, thinking from level 3, post-conventional morality, all forms of cheating is wrong. And you know why? Because you're cheating yourself. You're paying tuition for a course and you're not really learning anything. You're just paying to get credits. Because by cheating, you don't learn the principles of the course. You don't gain the educational value of it. You're getting credits so you can get through school, so you can go to work and get that credential, right? So in that sense, that person cheating is really a level 1 kind of behavior, right? Driven by self-interest. I just need the credits and I'm getting out of here, right? So they're not really driven by a sense of conventional morality or a sense of a higher level of doing the right thing, which is level 3. Okay? All right, so that's Kohlberg. Now, here I'm going to try to, and again, this podcast lecture is lasting quite a long time because we had to go through some of the major theories there. And these stages of development. So in a typical lifespan textbook, what you're going to see is that there are going to be these stages, and sometimes broken down into even more groups. So we have the prenatal stage as the stages of pregnancy, infancy through childhood, and oftentimes the childhood phase is split up into 2 different groups. So these are the groups, these are age ranges, stages of our life. Adolescence, right? A lot of changes happening there. Then we have emerging or young adulthood, and then we reach adulthood. Okay? And sometimes adulthood is split up into middle and later adulthood. So if you look at a lifespan textbook, these are the chapter segments you'll see, right, or sections. And then within that, you'll see a lot of the theories of development interspersed throughout these chapters, growth, about biological growth, about cognitive changes, and so forth. Okay? All right, so let me just breeze through some of these stages just to give you an example. Right. So, for example, during the stages of pregnancy, instead of using the term trimester, it's typical for a lifespan psychology course and biological psychology course to use terms such as these 3 terms. First of all, there's the germinal stage, right? So this is where the egg becomes fertilized, and so this is just the first couple of weeks. So a person may be pregnant and not even know it during the germinal stage, most likely, just the first couple of weeks. And now the fertilized egg has a name called the zygote. So the germinal stage in some textbooks is called the zygotic stage. So the zygote is going to graduate in week 3, and now it's called an embryo, right? So now we're in the embryonic stage through week 8, weeks 3 through 8. So that's the 2nd month of pregnancy, okay? So all of this is within the first trimester normally, right? If we're thinking about weeks. So already we're in two of the 3 stages, right? So the longest stage has to do with the fetal stage. That's now from an embryo we graduate, we get another piece of paper, and now it's my name is a fetus. Okay. Now this embryonic stage is actually very important because a lot of things can happen in a negative sense during the embryonic stage. A lot of vital growth is happening, so if that's interfered with, then birth defects could happen, as well as in the fetal stage, okay? So it's important to take note of teratogens. And this is almost anything in our environment or something someone's ingesting that could cause harm to the embryo or fetus, right? So some obvious ones that we know of. So it's basically a list of things to avoid during pregnancy. Alcohol, smoking, drugs, right? Those are pretty obvious ones. And some of the less obvious ones have to do with exposures to chemicals. So if someone in the household was doing yard work and handling fertilizers, right, they bring the clothing into the laundry hamper. If the pregnant person is the one doing laundry, they're exposed to those chemicals indirectly, right? Like secondhand smoke, or that's actually called third-hand smoke. So if the residue of a cigarette is on the clothing, right, and then the person is absorbing it or breathing it through the clothes that they're handling, that's third hand. Second-hand smoke means you're breathing someone's cigarette smoke that they're exhaling, right? That's second-hand smoke. Okay, so that's very, very important. During our last visit to Taiwan, we saw a lot of signs in public talking about second and third hand cigarette smoke, which is pretty interesting. All right, so obviously the hard drugs, but even prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs, someone has to be careful about ingesting. So teratogens is not only the responsibility of the pregnant person, but it's also the responsibility of the partner and people in the household. So because you don't want to expose the pregnant person to any of these things. So I would encourage the partner in the household to, don't smoke in the house, don't drink in the house, those things that you normally would do or normally would share with your partner, just don't have them around as either temptations or as an indirect way of that person being exposed to it, right? And also, sexually transmitted diseases are also part of teratogens because HIV, other kinds of sexually transmitted viruses can be transmitted from mother's blood to the fetus. Okay, sometimes the odds are very small. Okay, especially if someone's under HIV treatment, then the likelihood is small that the newborn will have HIV in their blood. But again, if they don't know and not being treated, then it's more probable. Okay. Now, if we talk about, that's the stages of pregnancy, okay, in 10 minutes, okay. So now if we talk about the newborn stage of development, one of the things to pay attention to is that newborns have a lot of reflexes, right? These are just automatic physical reactions that that a newborn is using to respond to their environment, okay? And some of these you can just test, okay? Obviously, they have the sucking reflex. This is just something they do. It doesn't even have to be food. It could be any object. It could be your finger, right? They're going to suck on it. It's just a reflex. They have no control over that. It's just what they do. They also grasp things. That's the grasping reflex. Some people confuse the sucking reflex with the rooting reflex, right? The rooting reflex has to do with when something touches the newborn's cheek, they turn, right? Well, usually it means that they're turning to suck and to eat, right? On a bottle or breast or a nipple. Well, that's a combination of rooting that leads to sucking. So some people think the rooting reflex is the sucking reflex. So they're actually they're different. They're different parts. Then the moral reflex is, and you can see videos on this. I wouldn't do this at home with your baby, but is where the baby spreads their arms out, right? When they have the sudden sensation that they might be falling. Okay, so you see videos of this in a laboratory where they're safely holding an infant and then suddenly sort of like almost act as if they're being dropped, right? Just a few inches, and then they see the arms fling out. Okay, I think as adults we kind of still do that, right? When we think we're falling, our arms just flail out. That's called the Moro reflex, Moro. Okay, all right, so that's really what I want to cover there, just to be brief. Now, in the category of psychosocial psychosocial development, attachment theory is very important in the early stages. And this is a common discussion item I use for my classes to talk about attachment and what your beliefs are. But the first couple years of life, the parent or caregiver and infant attachment creates an emotional bond, right? And this has to do with how we respond to our infants in need. If we're consistent, just like Erikson said, right, it produces trust, right? So in this theory, by the attachment theorists, they believe it develops the same kind of bond. And then this bond can lead to a healthier sense of their mentality growing up and have healthier relationships later on. Okay, so we want a healthy attachment. So some of the famous researchers in the field are Harry Harlow, that you may have heard about, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. And we'll talk about these three people real briefly. So Harlow has to do a very older researcher back in the day where he did experiments with monkeys and tried to see how baby monkeys would respond to having a fake uh, mother in the cage. Okay, would they just see it as an inanimate object? Would they try to bond with it, right? And they sort of had a furry texture and a fake head, right? And they found that these separated newborn monkeys, which may be an unethical thing to do, they separated from their mothers and they were presented with two surrogate mothers, right? So one made out of wire mesh could actually dispense milk, one made out of cloth but did not dispense milk. Okay, they spent time in different groups, right? And so what's interesting was the monkeys actually spent time clinging to the cloth monkey, like for comfort, but went to the wire monkey for food, right? And so the conclusion was that maybe there is something to this sense of comfort and security, right? That is more than just about feeding, that they actually require this sense of physical comfort. And they interpreted that as being attachment. Now, the researcher named Bowlby actually furthered this idea and defined attachment as this affection or emotional bond the infant forms with the mother, okay, back in the day, because the mother was a primary caregiver. And it's more or less universal, but it's not only the mother where this can happen. And the idea is that the parent represents a sense of security. They're a secure base, right? And you see this at playgrounds. And now don't observe playgrounds in a creepy way, right? But next time you just happen to be near one, and especially with the little tiny kids, you'll see that the ones with healthy, secure attachment with the parent is that they would like to hang around the parents, but they feel safe enough to explore the playground. And then after a certain amount of time, come back and check in with the parent. It's like, oh, I need to return to my secure base to recharge my sense of security. Okay, I'm recharged. I feel comfortable. Let me go explore the slide, okay, in the playground. And so this is a sense of, through observation, a sense of secure attachment, okay? And how do you create this healthy attachment? Well, a caregiver has to be responsive to the child's needs, right? So no neglect. And this is a matter of developing consistency, right? This is no different than being consistent as an adult, right? Is to be responsive. If as an instructor, I vary in the amount of intensity and consistency and caring in my language and frequency of emails, right? Then the students would have a different sort of level of respect for me, right? If I respond an email right away with a very warm language and make it really easy for them to ask me questions, then that gives a different vibe than if I were to answer an email very late and very short in a very sort of cold language, right? So it's about consistency and how one engages with an infant. And they have to sort of spend time together, right? Have mutually enjoyable interactions. So Dr. Ainsworth, Mary Ainsworth, and it was kind of interesting when I was in grad school, I had a professor named Mary Armsworth. Has nothing to do with anything, but just throw it out there. Okay, so Mary Ainsworth was the one who created the strange situation test that it's easy to go online and look on YouTube for videos of this, is where typically moms used in research and their infants, they volunteered to be in the study, and so they have a room where there's lots of toys. And initially the mom and the infant, and this is of all backgrounds, okay? Different kinds of, they didn't pre-screen them to have certain qualities, okay? But they would interview them and find out what kind of relationships and behaviors they're having at home usually, and then they bring them into the lab. And as rehearsed, the mom would leave the room, and of course, they observe through a one-way window how the toddler or the baby responds, right? Then the mom comes back. And also when a stranger enters the room, it's usually a teaching assistant, research assistant would come in, sit in the room, not really do anything in particular, but just be in the room. And then mom leaves the room. How does the infant react when they're when they're secure base, their mom leaves the room and they're in the room with a stranger, right? So through these different patterns, based on this scenario I described, Mary Ainsworth came up with, based on the patterns of what she saw, 4 types of attachment. Okay? First, there were 3 styles, and then they added a 4th later. So this is secure, avoidant, resistant, and disorganized. Okay? So a secure attachment obviously is the one you want to try to achieve. This is where they observe that the child uses the parent as a secure base to explore. They get upset when mom leaves, so that's a normal thing, okay? When child is up, sometimes the parents at home are thinking, oh, I leave my child and they're crying, well, I must not have raised them right. No, that's actually a good sign, especially when they're very comforted when you come back, okay? So at home, when caregivers are very consistent and sensitive to their needs, this is the end result and the pattern they see in the lab, okay? Type 2, avoidant, right? This is where the infant in that scenario doesn't seem very responsive to the parent, does not seem to come back to the parent as a secure base, and doesn't react one way or another when the parent leaves the room, right? The mother returns, they don't really seem that excited, okay? They don't really see them as a secure base, okay? And this is an end result of households where the caregivers tend to be lacking attention to the needs of the infant. That's called the avoidant attachment. Now, resistant attachment is interesting because they're also kind of clingy, but then when mothers try to interact with them, they would reject them and push them away, right? They're not really into exploring the toys in the room. They're very more so disturbed and angry when mom leaves, but then they're very difficult to comfort when mom comes back. So this is called resistant attachment. Okay, and this is also common when the caregiver is not very consistent with the level of response. Now, the disorganized kind of attachment is where there's very difficult to see a consistent pattern, right? They may behave oddly when mother leaves, right? They either freeze or they run around erratically. They try to run away when mom comes back. So it doesn't quite fit into the other three. And this is seen and correlated where there's abuse in the household, okay? And so these are the 4 different types of attachments seen by Mary Ainsworth, okay? All right, now, parenting styles is also covered in lifespan psychology, and this, I think, one can easily relate to and makes for a good discussion topic. So parenting styles are different patterns that, a parent would engage in, whether it's a single parent or a couple. So let's talk about these. And now, again, a couple of these sound kind of similar, but it's really important to know which one is which. Authoritative style is the ideal one. Okay, authoritative. And this is where parents have rules, right? They're very consistent with the rules. They're affectionate, and they also very much take into a child's point of view, and they listen. They want their children's input, right? So it's a very fair kind of democratic, semi-democratic style of parenting. Now, the authoritarian, which sounds a lot like authoritative, and sometimes students get them confused, but authoritarian is like a dictator, right? So the parents just want obedience. Just do what I tell you to do. Don't question it, right? There's not a lot of back and forth. They're very stiff and rigid with those rules, and they're not exactly the warm, fuzzy type, okay? And so it's basically a management style. Okay, authoritarian style of parent. So that is less ideal. Then you have the permissive style of parenting, where parents don't seem to have a lot of rules and they don't really use a lot of punishment. Okay, it's very permissive of what the kids are doing. Then, and usually the top 3 are the ones that Baumrind, the researcher, developed. But then now you have the 4th one called the uninvolved style. So the parents just don't seem to care much. Okay, and they're neglectful, and they really don't respond to the child's needs, and they don't really set any demands and rules around the house. So it's sort of a extreme permissive style, okay, where sometimes permissive style, they're very affectionate actually, and it's not really included in this chart, right? So they're sort of warm, fuzzy types. They want to be their child's friend, right? They're not really taking on the role of a parent by setting boundaries, okay, setting limits and setting rules and consequences. So that's why they don't punish much, okay? And that's more the permissive style. But the uninvolved style goes a step further and just being very neglectful and not very affectionate at all. So if you want to differentiate between permissive and uninvolved, the uninvolved is just, a step beyond in terms of that. So perhaps you can reflect back on your own parenting style and and maybe your parents' or guardian's parenting style. Now, as we move through these stages of life, now let's look at the adolescence, right? And the adolescent years are definitely very challenging, as usually most of the data and concepts and pages in a textbook involve the adolescent phase, right? So obviously you have the physical development where puberty hits, right? And so there's a maturing of the sexual glands. Certain secondary sexual characteristics develop. Um, Now, primary and secondary sexual characteristics, these are often confused, but basically, secondary sexual characteristics exist in boys and girls, okay? But sometimes but they're more often found in one or the other, such as the development of hips and breasts in girls, or facial hair and the voice change in boys, right? Um, so, if we're talking about the sexual glands themselves, right, the sexual parts, that's what we normally refer to as the primary sex characteristics. Those are the parts that we can see visually that differentiate male versus female. But then these other things that develop, such as the length of one's hair, the shape of one's body, facial hair. Now, we know there are females with facial hair, so this is not 100% true. My sisters, for example, well, should I go there? They actually have hairier legs than I do. I know it's kind of weird, okay? But they always were jealous, like, man, I wish I had your legs. I wouldn't have to shave all the time. So I know, okay, too much information. Okay, and so when it comes to this section of lifespan psychology, there are terminologies like menarche and spermarchy. Okay, I always thought these would make great pet names. Not really. Okay, don't do that. But this is the beginning of the menstrual periods for girls and the first ejaculation for boys, spermarchy. Okay, menarche is when a female person has their first menstrual period, usually around 12 to 13. Again, it depends. Okay, it depends on the cultural environment, depends on diet, depends on other types of factors, right? And there are growth spurts that exist in boys and girls, right? Statistically speaking, girls reach their adult height by 16. Don't tell my daughter that. And boys reach their adult height by the age of 17. But then again, okay, there's variety there. There's some variation. Or in statistics, we call it variance. Now, another thing to keep in mind, especially when you have teenagers in the home, is that a lot of their behaviors really have to do, as if we go back to Piaget's thinking, has to do with their biological development. So if you think about that, in these late teen years into the early 20s even, the development of the frontal lobe is still in progress, right? And think about what the frontal lobe is responsible for: judgment, impulse control, and planning. Think about what most teens are bad at: judgment, impulse control, and planning, right? So it's not as if the teen is doing a lot of these reckless things on purpose. But you'll see that those reckless type things tend to decrease over the years, right? Because of the development of the frontal lobe. All right, and cognitive development over the years in this stage, talking about teenagers, right? So if we refer back to Piaget, more logical thinking skills, formal operational hypothetical problems, okay, knowing how to design and plan things, okay, increase in mental capacity, right, and improvement on existing skills. So a lot of things are happening during these teen years, and also during these early years in adolescence, a theory of mind, and this is also called cognitive empathy, right, is the ability to take on the perspective of another person and feel concern for someone else. So this will increase during adolescence. I remember when we were living in Thailand, one of Emma's friends in primary school fell and hurt her chin. It was bleeding quite a bit, had a bad cut. And I remember Emma being just so upset, not so much that she was traumatized by the sight of blood, but she was just so empathetic and towards her friend who fell, thinking, oh, she must be in so much pain. And it was really interesting to see how much empathy she had for a classmate, which was kind of a good thing to see. Okay. All right. Now, if we talk about the emerging adulthood, just spend a couple minutes here. This is from 18 right out of adolescence to the mid-20s. This is a stage of development that's added to a lot of these lifespan textbooks. And The reason this is added is because actually, and not included in the so-called adulthood phase, because in a lot of societies that have become industrialized and modernized, those later adulthood stages in life are delayed, right? Marriage, careers, and so forth, spending more time in school, delaying having children. So in a sense, it's almost like an extension of adolescence, but we don't want to call it adolescence, so we call it emerging adulthood, right? Sort of this sense that they're not completely separated yet. They're still starting what we normally think of as adulthood, just at a later stage. So if we think about adulthood now, it's technically defined as being in the mid-20s all the way through early 60s, okay? And oftentimes in these lifespan textbooks, it's split up from early adulthood to middle to late adulthood, which is the elderly, 60 plus, right? And a lot of physical development is happening here, obviously, in terms of our vision, our skin, some sort of physical decline, muscle mass, and so forth, okay? But it's not all bad news, okay? It's not all bad news. Cognitive development, let's talk about that. A couple terms that you should know has to do with our types of intelligence. There's crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence, right? So crystallized intelligence is our ability to remember facts and information, right? Learn specific skills. So think of the word crystallized. They become very solid, right? Very solid and stable types of knowledge, for example. Gathered through life experience, through reading, through life experience. Then there's fluid intelligence, right? And this is our ability to process information, to reason, right? So it's not about a specific fact or a specific skill, but it's our memory skills, reasoning skills, processing information, and problem solving, right? That's fluid intelligence. So there's factual information and skills that's crystallized. Then there's fluid intelligence, right? Okay. And in adulthood and later adulthood, you'll see that fluid intelligence is what tends to decline over the years, right? Whereas crystallized intelligence tends to stay steady or improves over our lifetime through middle adulthood. All right, so let's talk about psychosocial development. I think so. A lot of the research is showing that some of the most important things about being happy is our social relationships, right? Having buddies, having people to connect with. Right? And sometimes it may just be one person. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. And depending on one's personality, some people may enjoy being alone, right? Whereas they've been with other people their entire lives. So it depends on the individual. But a lot of research is showing that some of the keys to happiness and long life has to do with either a stable marriage, having kids, and having these stable relationships with others. Okay. Let's see here. And one of the last things we'll cover here today, thank goodness we're coming to an end, is death and dying. Yeah, so we'll end on a cheerful note here. And a lot of these textbooks do cover Elizabeth Kubler-Ross from the 1960s and her stages of grief. And again, you'll see this played out in a lot of different comedy shows. I remember there was an episode of Friends, again dating myself, that had characters go through all these stages, as well as Frasier, of course. I don't know how I forgot the show Frasier. That was actually a nickname my friend gave me during college. Used to call me Frasier Chuang just because I was a psychology major. Yeah, predictable, right? All right, so these stages have to be looked at from a different point of view. That is, originally Kubler-Ross thought that we went through all 5 of these stages when we're experiencing grief of some kind, right? And how we view death. But this theory becomes more useful if you think about it more flexibly, that people can experience these different stages at different times and may not go through all the stages. And so it can be useful in that respect if you look at it from a modern point of view, that individuals, are not confined to this theory in a tunnel going in sequence, but there are 5 different circles that we might jump into at any given time, right? So these 5 stages, and you could, and not just they may not just deal with grief, right? It could be stages of shock. The reaction we get when we're diagnosed with an illness. Okay, so you can think of many different incidences in life beyond grief and dying that this might apply to. So the first one is not denial, right? And this one actually is very Freudian, right? It's a Freudian concept that because it is so stressful and overwhelming to conceptualize and think about, we just push it out of our consciousness. And that's a very Freudian idea. We deny that this did not happen, right? So it could be a very famous person who passed away or something shocking that happened like 9/11. The first reaction was, oh, denial. Like that can't be real, right? So you hear a lot of people use that kind of phrase. And then there's anger, stage 2. So once the denial wears off, we get very angry. It's like, how can this happen? How can my mother have cancer? How can, whatever that situation might be, a lot of angry outbursts. But then again, we're all individuals, so you may encounter people yourself that maybe you never went through the anger phase. You went through denial, then you go straight to bargaining, which is stage 3, where, for example, a person faced with a terminal illness, they'll start saying things to the doctor like, I'll do anything, things that I never would have considered. I'll bargain with God, my God, so to speak, I'll be a better person and do this in exchange for more years. So this is the bargaining process. Sometimes the bargaining is with their physician, right, or with family members. Then stage 4 is depression. This is kind of an obvious one where one feels like they lose a sense of hope due to the situation. And then stage 5 is acceptance, right, where more or less the person's at peace with what happened, okay, with the circumstance. And again, Kubler-Ross initially theorized that everyone goes through these stages in order, but today, in our modern lens, the way we can sort of make use of this theory without throwing it entirely out is to identify these 5 stages at any given time that a person may be experiencing. Okay? All right. Now, in terms of the actual ceremonies of death, right? It all depends on culture. I think all of you recognize this. Some are very somber types of ceremonies. Some are celebrations of life, right? The act of cremation versus burial is oftentimes very much cultural and religious based. When my grandmother passed away, this is back in 2008, yeah. And she suffered from Alzheimer's for about 10 years. And we went to the funeral all the way from Texas to Taiwan. And I had to take a couple weeks, and my employer and some people were questioning, why do you need to take a couple weeks for your grandmother's funeral? Some people don't even take time off for their grandmother's funeral. But this was a very cultural thing. Being a grandmother on my father's side, there's an emphasis on family names. So being the oldest grandchild of this grandmother, that it was important for me to be part of the ceremony. And the ceremony, the grieving process, and took over a week, right? And there was a lot of burning of, you may have seen this if you've seen this in some videos of China or in Taiwan, is that in Taoist culture, where they worship ancestry in a sense, right? So every household has a room, an ancestral room, to pay respects to ancestors. So you see a lot of old portraits and different kinds of statues of different gods, different spirits, that you burn incense and you do what's called in Mandarin bai bai, right? Paying respect at different times of the year, and you offer food and fruit. So whatever's offered is being sent to the ancestors. Now, when my grandmother died, they actually built a paper mansion on stilts, right? It's all flammable, right? And there's simulated money, so you throw it all over the place. And it's made out of a special material. And in Taiwan, during certain times of the year, there would be air pollution. And so now they've reduced it and said that, you know what, you don't have to burn this big stack of money for your ancestor. It's okay to burn this. And oftentimes they burn it as a way to symbolize good luck for a new business, right? But in terms of grieving process, that's what happened. We walked around in a circle holding a piece of yarn or string, and we started chanting things like, about our grandmother, certain phrases. It almost felt cult-like, but it's not. Okay, it's just a tradition. and then we would set the whole thing on fire. And so there's a little Mercedes and a scooter and a big screen TV and that little paper house. It's all kind of cute. And whatever gets burned gets sent to them, to wherever they are, right? And so they can use it. So that's why periodically during memorial type occasions once a year, there is the cleaning of the gravesite. And so it's common to leave it messy, and then that one time a year you bring all your family and start cutting the weeds and sweeping, right? So it's a normal thing to see very unkept graveyards. And then once a year it's cleaned out and offered fruit, and you burn incense and you burn the money, the fake money. Don't tell the ancestors that, okay, it's money that's being transferred to them. So it's kind of like an ancient ATM machine, okay? Or Zelle, okay? Okay, yeah, I'm losing it. It's getting hot in here in my mobile recording studio. Okay, if you have any questions, reach out to me. If you're listening to this on a podcast, you can find me on Twitter at JackBTeaching. And I hope you got a lot out of this extended lecture about lifespan and development. You can see there are many theories, psychological principles at work covering our entire lifespan. Okay? And this is called the lifespan perspective. Thanks, and I'll see you in a future podcast.